who came here to make a living from the sea and from the land, and they were here for many years, a very prosperous people. Then the explorers came to the island in search of wealth, and they dug the silver mines, many silver mines all along the island. In fact, we have a silver mine here in Cherry Cove, which you'll have the opportunity to explore this week. This is a part of the history. There were other attempts to make wealth here on Catalina Island. There was for a time a big sheep ranch that was settled out in the middle of, it's called Middle Ranch, towards the east end of the island. And then the island was made for a tourist location, which is what it is today, where they built a place in Avalon for a casino, and they have many visitors. In those early days, before there were many amenities, before there were doctors, there was a young boy, about the same age as many of you here tonight. His name was Jimmy White. Young Jimmy White was like many of you. He had a friend, and one day Jimmy White's friend grew sick and died of a childhood disease, something which would easily be preventable, perhaps even curable, if only there had been someone who knew what to do. And as Jimmy stood beside his friend's grave, he watched the casket lowered into the ground. Jimmy took a handful of the earth and he dropped that in upon the casket above his friend's face. And young Jimmy White made a promise to himself. He promised that he would become a doctor. He would become the doctor for Catalina Island, so that no one would have to die who might have otherwise lived, if only there was someone who knew what to do. Jimmy worked very hard in school, and soon he had the opportunity to go away to the mainland to study in one of the schools in the universities. He went to medical school. He graduated near the top of his class, and he could have gone anywhere in this country, to any of the large cities, and been a doctor, been very wealthy and comfortable for the rest of his life. But he remembered that promise he had made as a boy. And he came back here to Catalina Island to become the doctor, and set up a clinic in Avalon, and where he had a clinic attached to his house where he could sit in his office and look out over the sea. You can bet when the phones came to the island, the first phone lines, that one of the very first telephones on the island was on Dr. White's desk. And if you could get a call into Dr. White, no matter what time of day or night, no matter what the weather, he would come and he would help. Well, one day, Dr. White was sitting in his office. The rain was falling in sheets, and as Dr. White looked out of the window, he saw the gray clouds hanging over the harbor. The surf and the swell was coming in and pounding upon the shore. The water was all murky from the storm. There was a call. The phone rang. Dr. White picked up the phone. When he answered, he asked if he could help, and there was a voice on the other end that said, "Help me, please, help me." That voice explained to Dr. White how to find a cabin high up on a hill in a cove far from Avalon. And there was someone that needed Dr. White's help. The storm was so strong outside, but Dr. White was a doctor. He was the doctor for the island. He had to go. He put on his great raincoat, his yellow slicker, and his rain pants. He pulled his hat down over his head, pulled the boots on, and he headed out with his black leather bag filled with his doctor's equipment. He headed out into the storm. He got into his boat and he came along the coast. He entered into the cove, and there was a pier. And he tied his boat to the pier, and he crossed it and crossed the beach to where he found the trail leading high up onto the mountainside. It had already grown dark by this time, and Dr. White had his flashlight to light the way. Along the way, he slipped in the mud. He fell and cut his hands, and they were bleeding when he reached the cabin. He stepped up onto the porch, and his heart sank. The windows were boarded shut. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Dr. White thought to himself, how could anyone do this to me? Get me out on a night like this on a prank after all I have done for these people. He turned to leave, and as he did, it was almost as an afterthought that his hand reached out for the doorknob, and he twisted it. To his surprise, the door swung open easily, open inward. Dr. White turned and he shined his flashlight around the room. Again, he was filled with despair, for the room was covered in dust. Dust an inch thick stood in the windowsills and on the floor. May have been in the last sweep of Dr. White's flashlight beam, or perhaps a flash of lightning in through the open doorway. But just as he turned to leave, there in the floor in the dust, he saw the outline of a trap door, as if someone had lifted it and then let it fall back into place. Dr. White went over and he dusted it off, and they found the handle and he lifted it. And in that trap door there was a stairs carved out of the stone of the mountain, leading down into the mountain. Dr. White started down. The thought was driving him onward that perhaps someone needed his help. He had to go on. He was a doctor. He was the doctor for the island, and somebody down there perhaps needed his help. As he got deeper and deeper into the mountain, the stone walls drowned out the storm about him. He came to a door, and as he reached for the doorknob, and he felt odd to his touch, so he shined his flashlight upon it. And there, cast in brass and corroded, was the head of a man, an ugly little man, an ugly little green man, all covered with dust. Dr. White took that hateful thing in his hand and he twisted it. And the door opened inward and leading to more stairs, leading down into the mountainside. The deeper that Dr. White went into the mountainside, he began to notice that in the trails of his flashlight beams, there were ribbons of green and glowing light. The dust in the corridor about him began to glow green. And soon he came to another door. And when he reached the door, there, carved in the wood of the door, just at eye level where he had to look at it, was the head of a man, an ugly little man, an ugly little green man, all covered with dust. Dr. White opened the door and the light poured into the room, a room filled with green and glowing light and covered in dust. There in the center of the room, there was a desk, and on the desk there was a phone. Behind the desk there was a chair, and in the chair there sat a man, an ugly little man, an ugly little green man, all covered with dust. Dr. White went over and he scooped up the little man in his arms. He held him ever so gently. The man's head rolled back and his eyes opened wide. They were red and bloodshot. Out of the corner of the man's mouth there ran a trail of thick red blood. Dr. White held the man close to his ear so that he could hear him, and he said, "Little man, surely you can't be here all alone. Someone must care for you. A mother, a father, a sister, a mother-in-law." The little green man screamed, and he crumbled into dust. Thick green dust all over Dr. White's hands. It was then that Dr. White noticed how shriveled and green his own hands were. He turned for the door, but it wasn't there. He went to the walls and he pounded on the walls all around him, nothing but stone, solid stone. He went back to the desk and he picked up the phone. He dialed the number, any number, and when they answered, he said, "Help me, please, help me." Ah! Yeah, we're very grateful you came all this way to spend this week with us. Everyone arrived safe.